Hello. Sorry, I don't quite know what that face was for. I'm back, and so are you. Hello. Great to see you here again. And we are on Devil's Engine, Hell Walkers, and we are indeed walking through hell. Marlowe and Pan and Knight have basically tracked these giant conduits through hell and have reached the devil that lies in the middle of hell. They don't really know that it's the devil yet, but it's something very strange. And they climbed this kind of weird pyramid that's shaped like, or made out of bits of engine, and they've just reached the top. And Marlowe has just seen something in the top, which is like, oh. The title of the next chapter is called Home. And we shall find out what it is that's made Marlowe so freaked out. Okay. I'll try and get through 3 or 4 chapters today. And so I hope you've got a cup of tea handy. Home. He should have known that hell would save the very worst till last. He should have been ready for it. But nothing could have prepared him for this. Not the demons, not the ghosts, not the horrors they'd been through since materialising here. The summit of this engineered mountain was the size of a basketball court, almost perfectly flat. Right in the middle of it was another pool of black water, the same size as the one back in the Fist's original engine. There was only one building here, and the sight of it was enough to make him want to throw himself off the ledge and end it all. Not that jumping would have ended anything, of course. It was a house. A wooden house, the slats of the siding so old that there was only a haze of blue paint left. A set of steps led up to a front door that was shut tight, the filthy windows all closed too. The curtains were drawn, the porch coming loose. Dozens of those black tubes fed into the house, along with sections of engine that ticked and whirred like clockworks. The roof was missing, replaced by a bulging mass of black flesh that looked tumorous, diseased, one that stretched up into the seething gyre of the sky. It was a house, the kind you'd see on any street, the kind that a young family might live in, or an old couple maybe. Only he knew this wasn't home to either. He knew exactly who lived in this house. A woman, a teenage boy, and the ghost of a dead brother. It was a house. It was his house. He tried, but he couldn't find the words. It was like the storm had plucked them right out of him. It's a trick, he told himself. It had to be another of hell's games. The same thing that had forced them to see their mothers, fathers, brothers. You are seeing that, right? Marlowe asked, the words fluttering like sails in the wind. A house, said Pan. God, you'd think the devil would upgrade, said Knight, her laugh hollow. Pick somewhere with a good colour scheme, maybe. Fewer rats. Must be a recession down here. You see a house? Marlowe asked Pan, ignoring Knight. Blue, kind of brown door, steps. A Staten Island kind of house. Yeah, said Pan. Then she frowned. Wait, you know it? Marlowe nodded. Something big had crawled out from his stomach and was clawing its way up his throat. I live there. What? Said Pan. His mind was reeling like a bird thrashing inside a cage. It was only a matter of time before it broke free, before it got caught in the storm. He put his hands to his face, grabbed hold of it like he meant to pull it loose. His nails dug into the skin, the pain unbearable, but still more bearable than this. He closed his eyes and wished it all away. Please, please, please. But when he looked through his fingers again, there was the black pool, the raging storm, and that house, that awful, impossible house. And as he stared at it, tears streaming down his face, the door clicked open. Pam took hold of his hands, pulled them away from his face. Then she threw herself at him, her arms locked tight around his shoulders, her head buried in his neck. She was speaking, the words hot against his skin. We'll do it together. Whatever's in there, you won't be on your own. He pressed his face into her hair, wondering how, despite the fact that she'd been born here again, despite the fact she'd waded through the countless dead, despite the fact that none of them had washed for days, she still smelled just like Pan. He gripped her, held her like she was part of him, like she was keeping him alive. Which was true, wasn't it? It had been true since the day back in the parking garage, 1,000,000 years ago. He held her and breathed her until she pulled away, awkwardly, because he couldn't remember how to relax his arms. "You really live there?" she asked. "Yeah," Marlowe said, "like forever." He thought back as far as he could, which had never been far. He had spent his childhood here, but his memory of the place began from when he was about 5. He couldn't remember a thing before that, except the death of his brother. More nightmare than memory, dulled by age but sharpened by imagination. He'd always just assumed that when Danny had died, his brain had done some emergency surgery on itself, packed everything away in styrofoam and bubble wrap. It wasn't like there had been anything much of his childhood worth keeping. "But why?" Knight said. "I don't get it." "You think it's a trap?" asked Pam. "I don't know," he said. "What else could it be?" And for some reason his head answered him. The truth. "There's one way to find out," he said, forcing his reluctant legs to start moving. He reached out and felt Pam take his hand, Knight grabbing hold of the other one. He had the sudden, insane desire to start skipping like a kid between his parents, and before he could stop it, a giggle escaped his lips. The house replied, or something in the house. A voice seemed to spill out of it, just a whisper, the words somehow wrong, like they were being played backwards. Then another sound, a cry of grief, like somebody in there had just discovered the cold body of a loved one. A blade of pain pushed its way inside Marlowe's head, just above his left ear, and he had to let go of Knight to rub at his scalp. His skin was crawling as if there were maggots feasting beneath it. The house was 20 yards away now, and the door had opened further, revealing a shadowed hallway that looked just as he remembered it. "You think the devil's in there?" Knight asked. "Yeah," said Marlowe. Then, for a reason he wasn't quite sure of, he said, "Or something worse." 15 yards, and Marlowe had to look behind him because he thought he heard that voice rising up over the storm. There it was again, faint but close enough to make out Pam's name, called over and over and over. 10 yards. He could see the windows shaking in their frames, could hear the squeal of glass about to break. The whole building looked like it was about to collapse, only those pipes and mechanisms holding it together. 5 yards. And through the open door, Marlowe saw the wooden floorboards scuffed by Donovan's claws when the dog went crazy at the sound of somebody knocking. He saw the mirror on the floor, resting against the wall because it had fallen off months ago and Marlowe had always told his mum he'd put it back up one day. He saw the fans of letters stuffed behind the radiator, bills he knew his mum would never read. But the darkness was too heavy, too thick, to see beyond those first few feet. It looked like a throat, and Marlowe couldn't help but think of anglerfish, those glowing lures. The house looked like it could swallow him whole. "We go in together," said Pan. "Yeah," he said, "just give me a—" "Pan!" That voice again, behind them, louder now. "Pan! Pan!" She looked back, her face creased with anxiety. "Marlowe!" Another voice. He snapped his head back because this voice had come from inside the house. Thin and reedy, 1,000 years old. There was a desperate gasp for air. Then it called his name again. Marlowe. Not a sound, but something else. Something that seemed to come from inside him. "Your nose is bleeding again," said Pan, smudging it away, with her thumb. His head pounded in time with that relentless pulse, the force of it surely loud enough to liquefy his brain. It was impossible to think straight, and he wondered how long it would be before he, too, was wandering the cavern, drinking from those black pools, tearing off his own face. "You sure you want to?" said Pan. "Yeah," he said, trying to stare inside the house, trying to make sense of the darkness there. Whatever it was moving, swaying, beckoning. "Yeah, I'm sure." Because he had to know why his house was here. He had to know who was inside. He stepped up to the threshold, opened his mouth to speak. "Hello, who's in there? Whoever it is, I'm going to crush your ass." But nothing came out of his mouth. "Whatever it is," Pan said, "we deal with it together. All of us." Oh, missed page. And he could hear her whisper together again and again beneath her breath as she stood behind him, as she waited for him to take that step. He took a deep breath, the air full of the scent of machine oil, of blood, of copper, and of something else, something sweet. Then he walked inside. That sweetness hit him again, the unmistakable smell of rum, his mother's drink of choice. It dragged a memory from his head, something he hadn't thought about in years. Him running through the house, chasing the puppy that would later be named Donovan, skidding into the kitchen and swiping a full bottle from the kitchen counter. It had smashed, soaked in through the floor, through the chipboard of the cabinets, through the wallpaper. The house had reeked for weeks, but his mum hadn't been mad. She'd hugged him, told him it was okay, checked his feet for broken glass. Because everything had been new. Everything had been new. He had no idea what that meant, something itching at the back of his head, some long-forgotten truth, something that felt wrong. Movement up ahead, something big, something that seemed to fill up that ocean of darkness at the end of the corridor. It writhed like a nest of leeches, dozens of them coiling, sliding wetly over one another. "You see anything?" said Pam. Marlowe turned to her, and that's when he saw them, on the far side of the pyramid, a lumbering beast whose bloated belly dragged on the ground like the skirt of a wedding dress. Knotted around his neck was a woman, a girl, her tiny body twisted and knotted and scarred like it had been fed through a wood chipper. "Ah, not this asshole again," said Marlowe. Pan spun around, her fists bunched, in time to see Patrick throw his sister to the ground and start running, the ground actually trembling with the force of his footsteps. "Go!" yelled Knight. "I've got this." Patrick roared, halfway to them, his giant hands flexed, ready to rip Pan's head off for a second time. "Go!" Marlowe echoed, running out of the house. "Just..." Something coiled around his waist, ripping him inside so hard he thought his spine would snap. He grunted, seeing Patrick's catch-a-mitt's hand wrap around Pan's face. Marlowe just had time to mouth her name. Then the door slammed shut, and there was nothing but the boundless dark. The next chapter is called Unfinished Business. I remembered to fill my drink this time. It's a skull-shaped mug as well. How cool is that? Unfinished business. Patrick came at Pan like a freight train, too quick for her to react, his giant hand snapping shut around her face and starting to squeeze. "No!" she screamed into his filthy palm. She was lifted off the ground, Patrick's other hand around her arm and pulling hard. She could feel the immense power there, feel the fabric of her start to tear. Did that bit. And over it all, she could hear him laughing like a 2-year-old pulling the wings from a fly. He was going to kill her, and when she came back he was going to find her and do it again, and again, and again. "No!" she yelled, and this time she opened her mouth and clamped her teeth around Patrick's palm. She bit and ate. I just completely made that up. She bit and she kicked until she hit bone, and the laughter stopped. Patrick ripped his hand away, leaving a piece of it in her mouth. She still had her arm though, and he slammed her into the ground. Her head hit rock, and her thoughts kept going, sinking into darkness. Only for an instant, then she was back, hoisted into the air, Patrick's sagging clown face grinning down at her. "Why don't you stay dead?" yelled Knight, jumping onto Patrick's back. He grunted, letting go of Pam, too slow to grab Knight as she hopped onto the ground. Pam scrabbled around the side of the pool, watching Patrick's obese body jiggle as he chased Knight. It was only then that she saw that the front door of the house was closed. Where was Marlowe? Knight screamed as Patrick managed to grab her hair. She ducked, almost scalping herself as she twisted around him, breaking free. She drove her foot into the back of his leg, and he juddered onto his knee. Pam ran to them. She had no weapon, but she drove her fist hard into the back of his head. Patrick groaned, toppling like a felled tree. "Patrick!" screamed Brianna. She was scuttling across the pyramid like a spider, her knotted limbs clumsy and out of sync with one another, but surprisingly effective. "You take her," said Knight. No problem. Brianna was faltering already, her stunted arms collapsing beneath her. She face-planted just as Pan reached her, struggling to recover. She looked up, her face a patchwork doll's, even her eyes ridged with scars. But Pan could still see the girl she'd once been. "I'm sorry," Pan said. "I'm so sorry." Behind her, Knight was laying into Patrick with a vengeance. He was trying to get up, but his bulk was stopping him. His face was turned to her, infinitely monstrous but still his. Past the madness, past the rage, there was just Patrick Rabar, a boy who'd loved his sister so much that he'd followed her into hell. "I never wanted," Pan said. Then pain laced through her ankle before she could finish. She yelped, seeing Brianna there, her yellow teeth sunk deep into her skin. Tugging free, Pan staggered back, but Brianna followed, a lunatic hunger in her eyes. Pan's foot struck something and she fell, landing on her back. Brianna didn't hesitate, climbing awkwardly up Pan's legs, across her stomach, biting her hard in the chest. Pan screamed, trying to push the girl away, but Brianna's claws were under her skin, hooked there like ticks. "He never lets me eat," she was screeching, spraying the words out along with Pan's blood. "He never lets me eat!" Pan hit her, the strike driven by terror. Brianna's head snapped to the side, but she lunged forward again, her blood-stained teeth going for Pan's throat. Pan hit her again, then opened her own mouth and lunged for Brianna's face. They bit as one, agony riding a burning path up Pan's neck, her teeth scraping against Brianna's skull. The girl bubbled out a scream, scampered back. Blood as black as ink dripped over her terrified face. Pan felt like she had the weight of the underworld on top of her, but she managed to get to her feet. She pressed a hand to her throat, stemming the blood, then she kicked Brianna hard in the head. Pan reached down and picked Brianna up by her waist. The girl was a husk, so easy to lift that it took Pan by surprise. She lifted her above her head and skirted around the black pool. Patrick was still taking a beating, but he wasn't planning on staying down, his huge arms quivering with the effort. "Here, boy!" Pan yelled. Knight jumped off Patrick's back, and he lumbered slowly to his feet. His head was a mess, and it took him a moment to notice what Pan held in her arms. When he saw Brianna there, he roared, a sound of pure fury. He dropped onto all fours, running at her like a bear. "Oh, sheer Pan, run!" 2, racing for the edge of the pyramid. She skidded to a halt, nearly tumbling over herself. The ground was only just visible below, masked by clouds. "Brianna!" Patrick yelled. He was almost on her, kicking up a great plume of dust in his wake. She didn't stop to think. She just turned and threw Brianna as hard as she could. The girl tried to grab Pan, tried to stop herself, and for an instant her momentum nearly pulled Pan over the edge. Then her finger claws popped free, and she was falling, tumbling into the clouds. Pan ducked, Patrick a blur of blubber as he barreled over her head. She watched him fall, his descent almost graceful, but she turned away before he hit the ground. "Nicely done," said Knight, limping over and rubbing her knuckles. "They'll be back," said Pan. "He'll have to regenerate," Knight said. "It'll take time." "Do you see Marlowe?" Pan asked. Knight glanced behind her, as if only just noticing that he was gone. She shrugged. "It's not like him to miss a fight." It's exactly like him," Pan said. "I think he went into the house." "Then I guess we should go and help him," Knight said. She was already walking, and Pan followed. Everything ached, her heart on the verge of stalling, but she had the feeling that if they walked through that front door, then everything would end, one way or another. At least this way, she might be able to rest. And the thought of it, of not having to fight anymore, was so comforting that she didn't feel the tremor beneath her until it almost knocked her over. The entire pyramid was shaking, and there was a noise beneath her, an industrial growl growing louder and louder and louder until the air shook with the force of it. "Get down!" Knight yelled, throwing herself to the ground. And it was good advice, because a supernova of black light detonated from the middle of the pyramid, and with a final catastrophic roar, the house exploded. And the next chapter is called Stranger. For those Escape from Furnace fans amongst you, that will sound strangely familiar. Stranger. The house was eating him. It was eating him whole, its black tongue wrapped around his torso and reeling him towards a throat of absolute darkness. Marlowe fought. He drummed his fists against it, but it was dragging him too quickly, hard enough to knock him against the wall, then against the ceiling. Plaster dust rained down on him as the house wrenched him deeper, past the living room, heading for the kitchen. He tried to call Pan's name, but he was moving too fast. He couldn't get the word out. He smacked his head on the top of the kitchen doorway, and his thoughts scattered like crows. Then he was slowing, the pressure on his ribs growing weaker, then disappearing altogether. He fell to his knees, fireworks exploding in his vision, the pain like a demolition ball swinging between the two sides of his skull. "Marlowe!" The voice was a whisper, so close that it might have come from inside his own head. He blinked away the tears, tried to make sense of what he was seeing. He was kneeling inside his kitchen, a room he'd known his whole life. But where there had once been counters, units, an oven, a sink, there was now just a seething mass of shadow. It covered the floor, the walls, and where the ceiling was supposed to be, it ballooned upwards like a circus tent. The shadows moved like leeches, squirming against one another, the motion making Marlowe's stomach squirm. Two of those strands of liquid night approached him, coiling around his face like the fingers of a blind man, as if they were trying to work out who he was. Only they knew, because that voice came again, breathing his name. He noticed how quiet it was here, the sonic boom outside reduced to a uterine heartbeat. There was only the soft whir and click of the engine, that and the wet, sliding madness of the moving shadows. "Marlowe!" The pain was pushing into his right ear, insect sharp. He shook it away, angling his head to the side. Somebody was standing there. At least he thought it was somebody. It was too dark to be sure, and those shadows danced and played in front of the figure, around it, so that it seemed to flit in and out of existence. It was a man, he could tell that much. A man so worn by time and ravaged by age that he looked like a corpse. He hung in the corner of the room, literally hung, as if he had met his fate on the gallows there, and looked down at Marlowe with a face forged from sadness. He opened his mouth, more of those whispers scuttling out and climbing inside Marlowe's head. "You came!" The man groaned, his lips stretching too far, his tongue lolling out. His voice carried such a sense of grief that Marlowe felt it explode inside his chest, the tears a hurricane that battered against him. But he wouldn't show weakness. Not here. He couldn't. The hanged man twitched, jerking like a puppet on a string. He was making a noise that might have been laughter, might have been sobs. The coils of shadow that held him seemed to tighten, an anaconda strangling its prey. Marlowe thought he heard the word "careful" in the confusion, spoken in 100 different whispers. "I can't," said the man, and the shadows knotted themselves even tighter, making him groan again. "He was waiting for you, Marlowe. He has been waiting for you for so long. You should not have come." Who was waiting? Was there somebody else there, hidden by the night? Marlowe squinted, making out the top of the hanged man's head and something resting on it. It looked like a hand. Too big, too many joints, the fingers actually penetrating his skull, fused there. Marlowe followed it up, seeing a wrist, then an arm, and sure enough there was a shadow above the man, deeper and darker than the rest. He had to look away after a second, because whatever stood there radiated something evil, something that made Marlowe feel like his heart had been crushed. "I tried," said the hanged man, and he was weeping now. "I tried." Something replied to him, a sound that was almost too low for Marlowe to hear, like a church organ playing a subsonic note. It thrummed through him, making his stomach flutter into a cramp. "No," said the man, his voice growing weaker by the second. "No." "What's going on?" Marlowe asked. That noise again, and the shadow behind the hanged man moved, bending forwards into the room. Marlowe could make no sense of it. There was no face there, no body, just a shape, and a cluster of eyes that burned like inverse suns, which dripped negative light. "You!" Marlowe managed to say, recognising the creature from the pool, from the way it had watched him with those spider eyes as he forged a contract. "The devil!" "He's not the devil," the hanged man said. "He is a stranger." He thrashed against the darkness that held him, tendrils of shadow sliding into his mouth until he choked on them. The figure behind him loomed even closer, the room growing so dark that Marlowe wondered if he'd been blinded by it. 2 more fingers of shadow wrapped themselves around him, seemed to crawl inside his skin and coil around his ribs, his spine. The same subsonic noise rolled across the room, as powerful as thunder, and Marlowe understood that this thing, whatever it was trying to speak to him. He didn't understand the words, but he knew what it was saying. It rang like a clarion where his soul had once sat, loud enough to shake the world to dust.
"What is it you desire?"
The hanged man loosed a muffled groan. He began to twitch and shake again. He was chewing on the shadows, spitting out gobs of black fluid. "Do not listen," he wailed. "Do not listen to him."
"What is it you desire?"
"If you listen, then it's all over. Please." Marlowe slammed his hands to his ears, but it didn't do any good. The voices battling inside his head like artillery fire. He tried to move, but the shadows wormed their way even deeper inside him, wrapping themselves around his organs and turning them to ice. He was shivering so hard he thought his teeth would shatter.
"He has to see,"
said the hanged man. He was tearing at the darkness that held him, his stick-thin arms pulling chunks from it. The shadows inside the room were moving towards the man, a flood of them like they meant to drown him, and the hand that held his head like a bowling ball tightened even further, his skin making his skull making a sound like a glacier shearing in two. But his determination was relentless. He looked at Marlowe, growling. "You must see, you must see." "See what?" Marlowe said. The man ripped free of the last scrap of shadow. He tried to take a step across the room, only to be pulled back. He tried again, the crown of his skull actually coming loose, peeling away like the top of a boiled egg. The stranger uttered its foghorn cry as it attempted to restrain the man, bind him in darkness, and it was working. There were just too many shadows. The hanged man stopped fighting. He held out his hand to Marlowe. "You have to see the truth," he said. "It's the only way." Somehow, Marlowe found the strength to move. He pushed himself up, the ground writhing beneath his feet. He was almost lost now, submerged in darkness, but that hand was still there, held up like a drowned man reaching for a boat. "It's the only way to beat him," the hanged man said, his voice just a gurgle now. He stretched forward, something dripping from the bowl of his skull. His eyes began to roll up in their sockets, like they were trying to see what had been done to him. But that hand still reached forth. It still reached for Marlowe. Marlowe threw himself across the kitchen, swiping shadows out of the way. He ran, he reached, and he grabbed hold of the hanged man's hand. One last breath. Hey, I used that line in Fairness as well. One last breath. We all have to take one. That was in Escape from Fairness. Execution. I was trying to remember the name of the last book. One last breath. The change was instantaneous. One moment he was in the stomach of his old house, battered by night. The next he was standing in a sun-drenched woodland, pigeons cooing in his ear, and a gentle breeze blowing through his hair. He couldn't breathe, the shock of it paralysing him until he literally smashed a fist against his chest. He sucked in air that smelled of blossoms, turning in circles and feeling the grass beneath his feet, sharp and warm. "Where am I?" he asked. His voice older, grainier. It startled a pigeon, and it broke from the canopy, its wings clapping. "This looks like heaven."
"Not heaven,"
said the hanged man.
"The beginning of hell."
Something inside Marlowe's head shifted, and he felt somebody else take control, steering him out of the woods and onto a dirt track that ran between the hedges. He could feel an urgency that didn't sit with the rest of the illusion, a panic that came from nowhere. Then there was a distant scream, and he started to run. Smoke was rising from behind the bushes, clawing its way into Marlowe's nose. He skidded around the corner to see a house. Cottage, really, small and thatched. It was on fire, the heat searing Marlowe's eyebrows even though he stood 30 yards away, the inferno so fierce that it took him a moment to see the children in the flames. There were 5 of them, 4 boys and 1 girl, the youngest maybe 8, the oldest no more than 14. There was something familiar about 3 of them, something really familiar. Marlowe knew them, but he couldn't think from where. They hung from the windows, screaming. Panic raged inside Marlowe, one he knew didn't belong to him, but which he felt with every iota of his being. He opened his mouth and howled, breaking into a run. But he was too slow. The cottage was old, made of thatch and stick, and it took only seconds for the flames to swallow it whole. One by one those faces vanished into the smoke, until the last scream was lost in the roar. Marlowe could hear himself shouting, words spilling from him that he'd never heard before. He was himself, but he'd also become somebody else, the father of these children, the hanged man. He felt his body shudder and tremble, felt the weakness there, the disbelief, the unbearable sense of loss. He was running again, pushing himself into that wall of heat. He could feel the force of it against his skin, but he couldn't stop, barreling through the open door of the cottage. He called out, his children's names boiling into nothing inside his throat.
"He was waiting for me," the man said.
"Who?" Marlowe asked. "Why are you showing me this?"
"Because it explains everything," the man said. "Hurry, we do not have long."
Marlowe could feel something pulling at him, something cold and dark trying to tug him free of the head he was inhabiting. It was gone in an instant, burned away by the fire. He stumbled into the inferno, his tears hissing. There was no air at all, just a fist of smoke rammed into his throat. "Please," said Marlowe.
"There is nothing I can do," said the man. "This is just a memory. Don't you think I would have changed it if I could?"
A jagged bolt of lightning tore across Marlowe's eyes. He tried to take a breath, but couldn't even bring in a scrap of oxygen. It was worse than any asthma attack. It was merciless, brutal, and he clawed at his neck, his chest. And then he saw it, even through the flames, even past the tears. He saw the ground beneath him begin to crumble into dust and ash. There was something down there, a face buried in the fire, a face that opened its eyes and looked right at him. Death was flooding in, collecting in the corners of his vision, in the cradle of his brain. He was making a sound like a hiccup over and over, but the fire was doing its job well. It was killing him. The thing in the dirt was angling itself upright so that it could study him, its face unfolding like origami. Its body was too long, arms with too many joints, curled tightly to its chest like a praying mantis. It seemed impervious to the fire, its beetle-black skin glowing. It never took those dark eyes off him, and he screamed, "Hurry, hurry, hurry," with his breathless lungs, because he knew that this thing, this stranger, was worse than the loss of his family. He knew that it was worse than death. It rose up before him, a creature that belonged only in nightmares. Its face was an engine of parts, layers upon layers that fumbled and switched around each other like it was trying to work out how to look human. Only those eyes remained unchanged, eyes that seemed like holes cut into the fabric of the universe, revealing the impossible darkness of what lay beyond. They watched him with what might have been curiosity, or hunger, or glee, or love. Marlowe collapsed and knew it would be the last time. All he wanted, all the hanged man had wanted, was to rest here, to be reborn in paradise with his children. But the stranger unfurled one of those 2 long arms, uncurled a finger that had 4 or 5 joints, all of them crackling in the heat like fireworks. It rested a long, filthy nail on Marlowe's forehead. Its face folded and unfolded until a mouth opened in the very centre of it.
"Their death does not have to be the end,"
it said in a voice of quiet thunder, a voice that pushed back the power of the inferno. Marlowe's brain was shutting down, section by section. Death could only be seconds away, a void that loomed up before him, impossibly big and unfathomably empty. He felt the creature run its nail almost tenderly down his face, along his cheek, tracing the edge of his gulping mouth.
"It is not too late for you."
It was, though. It was too late.
It is not too late for them.
And even though Marlowe had no breath left to give, those words took his breath away. He felt it, the smallest flicker of hope in the churning ocean of pain.
All you have to do is accept my gift. All you have to do is say yes.
All he had to do was say no. All he had to do was say no. But he didn't. His vision was a tunnel and he was being sucked inside it. The creature was growing more distant, shrinking from him, but he watched as it drew its nail along the putrid flesh of its throat, releasing a sludge of black blood that instantly started to bubble and boil. It dipped the nail into the wound, shuddering with what could only be pleasure. Then it extended its arm again, held that dripping finger before him.
Let us make a deal, you and I. One deal, sealed in blood. What is it you desire?
He saw them, the faces of the children, and Marlowe suddenly understood why he knew 3 of them. Maman, Meridiana, Ostheim. The panic was ocean deep, drowning him even though he knew this was just another man's memory. Right now he would give anything for another breath. He would give everything he had and everything he was for just one more breath.
All you have to do is say yes.
Marlowe should have said no. The hanged man should have said no. But death was on him, and despite the fire it was cold. So cold. He should have said no, but he saw their faces. He saw the faces of his children. He should have said no, but instead he opened his mouth and used his very last breath, the very last of himself, to speak one final word. Yes. I was going to say something funny there, like chicken or macaroni, but I thought that would ruin the moment. We've got time for one more. Yeah. Next chapter is called... Oh, this is the last one before the... Oh yeah. Oh, okay, so we'll do this one because it's the last one it's the last chapter in this part, and it's also where we learn what this devil is. So let's go for it. Hang on. Okay. The stranger's face rippled like a machine, the black pit of its mouth widening into a smile, its eyes dripping darkness. Then it slid its nail into Marlowe's mouth, the blood dripping onto his tongue, sliding down his throat, tasting of rot.
It is done!
A supernova of inverse light detonated inside his skull, and suddenly the scene changed. The house, the fire, the stranger exploding into dust. Marlowe reeled inside a tornado, pieces of scenery clicking into place like a stage set until he saw a workshop, stone walls lit by torchlight. He turned his head left, then right, taking in workbenches littered with tools and mechanical parts.
I was a watchmaker, said the hanged man. Maybe that's why he chose me.
Who? Said Marlowe. But he knew the answer to that, because he saw the stranger in the corner of the room, cloaked in shadow, its face click, click, clicking like an insect as it watched him. He felt that strange sensation of being pulled, like he was a fish on a hook, half remembered some other world where his real body lay surrounded by coiling shadows.
Just pay attention, said the watchmaker. I cannot hold you in this memory much longer.
Marlowe saw his hands starting to work, sliding an axle through a cog and fixing it to a metal frame. He carried it across the room into that pool of shadow where the stranger stood. Marlowe noticed that the creature was surrounded by mechanisms, glass pipes protruding from its body. The skin of its chest had been pulled away, its ribs cracked open and emptied. Beside it, pinned like a butterfly, rigged with tubes, was a shriveled heart that beat weakly. Marlowe slotted the clockwork piece into the apparatus, his hands shaking. The stranger made a noise like a cat purring, its body flexing, shuddering, rippling.
It was dying, said the man. Its heart was too old to keep beating. It needed a way to stay alive.
A machine, said Marlowe.
An engine.
A door opened at the other end of the room and a child ran in, one of the boys Marlowe had just seen in the burning house, one of the children that had died. He laughed, trying to close the door against the young girl who was chasing him. Then they were all bursting through, shouting at one another, giggling. The joy in Marlowe's heart belonged to the man he knew, but it was still as welcome as dawn, filling him with sunlight. He found himself laughing too, even when the children turned to him and he saw that their eyes were as black as pitch, as empty as unfinished dolls. They fell silent together, seeming to sag and deflate for a moment before remembering themselves. They ran from the room.
I should have known they weren't real, not the way they had been. There was something foul, something he dragged up from the darkest part of the world, or made from the foulest part of himself. He tricked me.
Marlowe felt a cold hand wrap itself around his spine, pulling hard. The edges of this place, of this memory, started to fray, and he clung on with everything he had. The scene began to speed up, his hands working tirelessly, the engine growing and growing and growing, filling the room, expanding out into a cave and then a cavern filled with bone, a graveyard. Marlowe realised, it was a graveyard, Marlowe realised, remembering Paris, becoming a cancerous mass of parts that was relentless. For millennia, those 5 children watched and played, climbing, hiding, sheltered by the engine, drinking the blood that flowed through it, their humanity belied only by those inhuman eyes. And all the while the stranger stood there, its disembodied heart pumping, filling the engine with contaminated blood. "What is it?" Marlowe asked.
"Evil," said the man. "It is evil and ancient and wrong. Something that never should have been here, which slipped through the cracks. It has roamed the earth for centuries, making deals with humankind."
"But how?"
"Its blood is rotten, but powerful. Drink it and you do not die. Drink it and you are no longer human. Drink it and anything is possible."
Speed, invisibility, mind control, anything you wished for, Marlowe thought. The engine had granted every desire, and it had all come from this.
But it was old, so old. It was losing itself and it needed my help. It tricked me into building the engine. It showed me what to do, how to put the pieces together. And it held time at bay. 100,000 years is nothing to it. It became nothing to me.
Marlowe watched as the engine grew, as the watchmaker put 1,000,000 pieces in place, and then 1,000,000 more, as he chiselled out a pool from the stone and filled it with the stranger's blood. The scale of it was infinite, unthinkable. He wouldn't have believed it if he hadn't already seen it.
And I came to love them, those things that were not my children. How can you not love something that you spend infinity with? I came to love them as I had loved my own flesh and blood. And they loved me too. They changed. They remembered themselves. But I did not forget. In all that time I did not forget that it had deceived me.
"What did you do?" Marlowe asked.
"I deceived it."
A roar of outrage shook the memory, so hard that the vision began to dissolve. Marlowe could still see through the watchmaker's eyes, though, as he ran frantically through the engine, as he ducked beneath mechanisms, as he tried to cover his tracks. The engine surrounded him like an ocean in a storm, every piece of it moving, every piece of it furious. There was something in his hand, something that might have been an old-fashioned lantern, a canister ribbed with metal parts, with glass tubes. This thing didn't give off light, though. It seemed to pulse with darkness, and when Marlowe looked more closely, he saw the stranger's heart there, the devil's heart, pumping. In all those years it never expected me to know enough to change its design. Marlowe looked on as the watchmaker pulled a knife from his pocket and ran it across his palm. He rested the wound against the canister and its mechanisms began to twist and coil around themselves, sealing it. But I did know enough. The engine crashed to a halt, every piece of it freezing and plunging the cavern into silence. I knew enough to change it. Then it began to turn again, backwards this time, everything working in reverse. I knew enough to turn it against him. Another howl filled Marlowe's head, turning his brain to jelly. His stomach lurched like he was inside an elevator. He could feel himself moving. Not him, but the whole cavern, the whole engine, slowing to a halt again after a handful of seconds. The stranger came to trust me over time. It trusted me with the very essence of itself, its heart. Its heart? Marlowe asked. Not a heart like you and I would understand it. It is the darkest part of it, the core that birthed the star. Without its heart, it is just a devil. And with it? Marlowe asked. The watchmaker sighed. With it, it is a god. Why didn't you just destroy it? Kill it? The stranger cannot be killed. It is too old, too closely connected to the foundation of the universe. Neither can its heart be destroyed, as far as I know. But I locked it away inside a mechanism that cannot be opened by infernal forces or by human ones. And I used the stranger's power, his blood, and split the engine into incarnations of itself, each one trapped inside time. I trapped him here, inside this one. My children hid his heart inside another, somewhere he could never find it, some place he could never reach. What happened then? Marlowe said, craving the truth like he was craving water. Then he turned one of them against me. The scene juddered to a halt, 4 of the 5 children standing around their father, around Marlowe. They were in a corridor, the stone walls damp, the air cold. One of the boys twisted the handle of a red door and opened it, night flooding inside. Hurry, said Marlowe, the words spilling out of his mouth in another language, its meaning perfectly clear. He's coming. A shout from the other direction, full of rage. The 3 boys fled through the door, leaving just the girl. She ran forward, threw her arms around Marlowe, sobbing into him, and he pried her away. Past the tears, her eyes were a brilliant shade of green, as human as anything Marlowe had ever seen. You have to go, Meridiana. You have to leave me. I won't, she screamed. I won't. One of the boys ducked back in, and Marlowe knew it was Maman. He was holding the canister, the heart pumping so furiously it sounded like it was calling for help. He took hold of his sister with his free hand and dragged her through the door. Behind them came an animal cry, and Marlowe looked to see the missing brother there, his face warped into a carnival mask of anger, his eyes blazing black light. Father! Come with us, pleaded Meridiana, but the watchmaker turned to her and shook his head. I have to lock the door, he said. Go, and remember that I love you, always. He smiled at her, smiled at all of them. Then he grabbed the door and slammed it shut against their cries. He muttered a series of words and the corridor shook almost imperceptibly, the weird elevator lurch rising in Marlowe's guts again. The last brother, Ostheim, Marlowe knew, how could it be anyone else, ran the rest of the way, barging past his father and opening the door. Marlowe had to hold up a hand against the tide of daylight. He saw a field of snow and beyond that a mountain. The children were nowhere to be seen. No, Ostheim said, turning to his father. What have you done? It doesn't matter, he replied. It's over. It cannot be undone. Ostheim pulled a knife from his belt, a shard of the engine, and he rammed it into Marlowe's stomach. He doubled up, feeling the boy hoist him onto his shoulder as if he were a sack of feathers. Then they were running back through the engine, ducking beneath the mechanisms, climbing the cogs, leaving a trail of steaming blood in their wake. They ran deeper into the machine like they were running through a forest until they stopped at the feet of the stranger. Where is it? The creature boomed. You will never have it, the watchmaker replied, locking the truth of the hidden canister away inside his head. You will never find it. I have made it impossible. You are trapped here. You will never leave. It does not matter. I will have it. I can wait here until the end of time, and you will wait with me. The stranger reached for him with those impossible arms, grabbed the top of his head, and squeezed. The pain was molten, those fingers drilling into his skull, pulling him close. You will wait with me. More shadows closed over him, sliding into his mouth, down his throat. He felt the flow of cold blood, felt its evil spill into him.
You will wait with me and know that your children will die again. They will die slowly, and their pain will last forever.
Inside the memory, Marlowe gagged, trying to scream past the blockage in his throat, trying to fight it, but he was too weak. Blood still gushing from the wound in his stomach, his strength deserting him. Slowly, he sank into that squirming nest of shadow, the stranger's hand pushing him deeper into darkness.
You will wait with me until we are free.
I'm sorry, Marlowe said in the voice of the watchmaker, not even sure who he was speaking to. I'm sorry. God forgive me. Then there was nothing. Ink thick and choking. He felt that tugging sensation again, pulling him out of the memory. And he was glad to go, because he couldn't bear to be here, couldn't bear to see any more. Do you understand why I showed you? Asked the watchmaker, as the edges of the dark started to crumble. Do you understand? I tried to keep you away. He had, Marlowe saw. The watchmaker had a power all of his own. He saw him forging the ghosts, giving them their stolen faces and sending them out into the wastes of hell. He saw them slaughter engineers one after the other, again and again, until they lost their minds. I could not risk anyone finding us, he said. All it will take is a deal between infernal forces, between things that should not be, and everything is lost. A deal will unite the engines, and in doing so will bring this world and yours crashing together. Do not listen to him. Do not bargain with him. Do not set him free. You can end this, Marlowe. You can end everything. But I don't understand, Marlowe said, the information breaking up into molten fragments as it burned into his head. Why me? Why are you in my house?
Because it is you who...
The memory let go, and Marlowe was catapulted across the void, back into his body, back into the fury of hell. He gasped, seeing his kitchen, seeing the shadows that writhed and squirmed, that coiled around the hanged man, drowning him. The stranger was there, its face folding and unfolding, just like it had in the memory, its eyes dripping. It extended its free hand, coiling its fingers around Marlowe's throat and lifting him up, drawing him to it. It gave off a stench of rot, of unimaginable age, and unquestionable power. There was a cavity where its heart should have been, stuffed with straw, as empty as a nest. Pipes and tubes and cogs formed an apparatus inside and around it, making it half monster and half machine.
Lies,
it said. No, replied the hanged man, and the shadows contracted like a fist around his head, unleashing a crack like a cannon shot. The man dropped to the ground, and the stranger ripped its hand free, shaking loose pieces of skull and bone.
Lies,
it said again.
It knows how I can help you.
Never, croaked Marlowe.
It knows how I can help her.
It waved its other hand, and the kitchen blew apart, the walls exploding outwards in a hail of shrapnel. Suddenly the cavern was all around him, the raging storm overhead, pieces of house bouncing and sliding over the top of the pyramid. Pan was there, night too, with no sign of Patrick or his sister. The stranger stood straight, its mechanical parts whirring and grinding, linking it to the vastness of the engine. Tubes and pipes ran into it from every direction, pumping black blood. It hoisted Marlowe, its hand as tight as a hangman's noose. Marlowe! Shouted Pan, running for him, then stopping, throwing a hand to her face against the energy that radiated from the stranger. Marlowe hung there, his feet kicking pathetically at the air.
I can help her, it said. I can set her free. I can send her home.
Run! Grunted Marlowe, the word too quiet for anyone to hear. He tried again, shouting it louder, only to feel those fingers tighten even further. Pan held up her hands, her face full of terror. Let him go, she said, please.
Come to me, child.
The stranger's other hand unreeled as long as a tree branch. It caught Pan, lifting her effortlessly so that she was hanging next to Marlowe. She pulled desperately at its fingers, choking, her eyes bulging.
Tell me what you desire,
said the stranger, its hand squeezing. Pan was choking, her eyes rolling up, her body convulsing.
Tell me that you want to leave this place. Tell me, and it is done.
Marlowe reached out for Pan. He found her hand. She gripped him and he held her, watching as she fought for her last breath. She shook her head and he knew what she was saying. He knew she was telling him not to make a deal, because she was stronger than him. She had always been stronger than him. All he had to do was say no. Pan would die, but she would come back. He might die and he, too, would be reborn. Hell was bad, yes, but they could survive it together. All he had to do was say no, but Pan was shaking hard, foaming at the mouth. How many times would he have to watch her die here? 100? 1,000? It would never get easier. He would never grow used to it. 1,000 deaths, and he knew each one would be worse than the last.
Tell me what you desire, Marlowe, and it is done.
All he had to do was say no, but he opened his mouth and said yes. The stranger laughed, a noise like thunder. Marlowe fought against the chaos in his head, tried to remember what he'd been told the first time he'd been thrown into the black pool, the first time he'd made a deal. He could almost see Seth, the old man who'd shown him the ropes, as he said it. It is the man who wants everything, and he who does not know what he wants who lands himself in trouble. And what had Pan told him? To be sure of what you're dealing for. The engine, it will try to trick you. It will try to fool you into making an unbreakable deal. I want to go home, Marlowe said, dredging the words up past the fingers around his throat. I want to go home. I want Pan to go home. I want Night to go home. I want us all to go home. He could hear the hanged man moan in despair, and Marlowe knew that he was making a mistake. All he had to do was say no, but he was cleverer than that, wasn't he? He could make this work. But only us three, Marlowe said. Once we're through, the passage closes. Nobody else gets out. You don't get out. That would work, wouldn't it? If the watchmaker was worried about setting the devil free, then surely this would work. He swung from the stranger's grip, his thoughts sloshing back and forth, too messy to make sense of. It wasn't enough. He needed more. No, the gateway is destroyed, he grunted. When we're through, all of us, me and Pan and Night, the gateway to hell is destroyed and it can never open again.
And that is all?
Just us, Marlowe said. That's what I want. I want us to go home. The stranger laughed again, loud enough to shake the world, to shake the whole of hell.
It is done.
I think Marlowe might have made another mistake there. That is the end of the first part of the book. I've got 3 parts, just like in the other ones. I didn't even tell you what the first part was called, did I? It is called Wild Dreams Torment Me, and the next part is called Who Holds the Devil? The last part called... I'll tell you when we get there. So there we go. That is the devil. It's a very confusing story, but it's all based on that idea that you can make a deal with the devil. This watchmaker who lost his kids, and the stranger had the ability to grant him his wish, but only if the watchmaker worked for him, only if the watchmaker helped keep him alive and helped build him this enormous machine. We'll find out a little bit more about it later, I think. I can't actually remember. But yeah, that is a stranger. The stranger is very similar to the one in Escape from Furnace, and I think you find out a bit later why they're connected. This is the Alexander Gordon Smith multiverse. Are you alright, Eva? That's Eva at the door. I better go. I have been summoned. But yes, I will see you very soon. We'll come back for some more very soon, hopefully tomorrow. Until then, take care of yourselves. See you later. Bye.